I went through 12 years of grade school and an entire undergraduate degree before I learned how to learn. If you clicked on this video, chances are you want to know the most effective way to learn. And that's exactly what I'm going to teach you today. And I will share the tools that I used to set the curve on every exam that I took for my computer science degree. Learning occurs in 3 steps. This video will cover those 3 steps: intake, digestion, and recall. Each one of these steps is unique, and each one has different areas where you can optimize to get better results. Let's begin with intake. To learn something, you have to take in new information. This can come in several different forms, and it's best if you consume the same material in multiple different ways, because doing that allows you to get 2 different or multiple different perspectives on the same material, which can help you draw connections that you wouldn't otherwise draw if you just got your source from one material. One of the most powerful things I like to do when I'm intaking new material is priming myself. Priming occurs when you know that you're going to have some sort of interactive learning coming up. The way you prime yourself for that learning is to consume an independent material, such as reading a textbook or watching a YouTube video, to gain some beginner or cursory knowledge on that subject so you can have questions ready when you are in your interactive learning session, such as a lecture. So the first important thing is priming. Take in information prior to a lecture or interactive style learning so you can go in with questions before the learning activity. So the next important thing to do is ask questions. This serves 2 purposes. 1, it makes you think about the material critically in order to come up with good questions to ask. And 2, it keeps you engaged during the lecture. If you are trying to listen to the lecture and figure out questions to ask about things you don't understand, you're going to be far more engaged, and the information that you gain from that lecture will be much deeper and you'll understand it much better than if you just sit passively without trying to come up with and ask good questions. Now, let's talk about digestion. You may be thinking, why do I have to digest? I'm not eating. That's true. But when you learn something, in a similar process to consuming food, you have to take some time to mull it over and to actually intake the information that you've learned and let it resonate and draw connections with it. So that's where digestion comes in. Now, I've talked about the read, walk, write cycle. I believe that the walk is the digestion part of that learning cycle. But more broadly, digestion is taking the material that you just learned and thinking about it and trying to apply it in new ways. And the application in new ways is a great way to cement that knowledge in your mind. And the reason for that is because when you try to use it in a novel way, you have to think about it far more critically than when you're just passively intaking. Finally, let's talk about recall, what you all came for. Recall is where it all gets put to the test. And in fact, you may be using recall on your test. But the thing is you can be practicing recall through the entire learning path, not just on the exam. So oftentimes what people will do, and what I did for a long time, was I would not study until the night before the exam or 2 nights before the exam, and then I would cram. The problem with that is it gives you that information in your head in your short-term memory, but it doesn't cement into your long-term memory. And so this is the benefit of using recall throughout, say, a semester. If you are working to actively recall stuff you learned at the start of the semester, and you come back to that stuff once a week or maybe once every 2 weeks, you are going to cement that in your mind far better than if you learn it, don't touch it, and then come back to it 3 months later. So this is where recall comes in. And there's several ways you can do this. One of my favorite is, after some time, try and teach yourself or someone else about what you learned. This idea was proposed by Nobel Prize winning physicist Richard Feynman, and it's called the Feynman technique. It's super helpful because when you go to teach something, you have to have a good understanding of it if you're going to teach it very well. And teaching it to someone else is even better because they can ask questions. And when you get asked a question, it makes you think even deeper about the topic that you're trying to teach. And therefore, you learn that topic even better. Learning essentially boils down to the compression of information. We take in huge amounts of information every single day. And when we're learning something new, we take in a huge amount of information. And the best learners know how to take that information and compress it down into something that is relatively small and approachable, that they can dive into within their minds and then expand whenever they need it. Teaching is also great because it makes you create metaphors or analogies for what you're teaching. And again, this makes you think about it in a different way. If you're noticing a theme here, one of the biggest parts of learning is thinking about the same concept in multiple different ways. When you do that, it forces your mind to think creatively about what it's learning. And as it thinks creatively, it gains ownership over that knowledge, and that knowledge becomes your own. Working on all 3 of these things in a continuous cycle is the best way to learn. This can also be applied to like a semester style class where each day you're intaking new information. Between each class, you can digest and then try and recall. If you don't want to try and recall every single day, you can do this once a week. Try and recall all that you've learned that week. So now let's go into some tools that you can use to better learn. Obviously, I already mentioned the Feynman technique. Richard Feynman was a brilliant guy, and he recommended this as a learning technique. And I believe it was Albert Einstein said something along the lines of, if you can't explain a concept to a 5-year-old, you don't really know the concept. And I think this is a great technique because, like I said, it makes you reframe your thinking, think about concepts that you've learned in new ways, and it makes you explain those concepts, which really reveals the gaps in your knowledge. Another great technique is exponential backoff. What is exponential backoff, you may ask? Learning, essentially, is taking knowledge from your short-term memory and translating it into long-term memory. Long-term memory is the stuff that you learn that you can go back to years later and be like, oh yeah, I know this. That is knowledge that has been put into your long-term memory. And this is where exponential backoff comes in. Exponential backoff is a concept in computer science that's often used for testing. If you are running a test and it fails, exponential backoff essentially says, okay, let's wait twice the amount of time and then try again. And if it fails again, okay, we'll wait twice the amount of time and then try again. You can apply this to learning to help you move memories from your short-term memory to your long-term memory. When you learn something new, think of a recall pattern that mimics this exponential backoff. When you first learn it, review it every single day. And as days go on, you can spread out that learning. So it goes from every single day to every other day to every 4 days, 8 days to every 16 days. What you'll notice is following an exponential backoff model, you will only have to revisit something maybe 4 or 5 times before the midterm comes up. Following this model helps you better remember those things. To explain this a little bit deeper, learning goes something like this. The y-axis is knowledge, the x-axis is time. When you learn something, you get this initial spike of knowledge. And as time passes, if you don't revisit it, it decays like this. If you revisit it, comes to here, it now starts to decay slower. And then if you revisit again, you bring it back up to that baseline knowledge, and now it's decaying even slower. And then you revisit again, and eventually, the rate at which it decays, because it's been solidified in your short-term memory, becomes almost non-existent, and then it's permanently in your memory, and that's when you really know the subject. So that's the benefit of exponential backoff. Another trick that I've used that's really helpful, especially if you're studying for an exam, is to use ChatGPT to give you quiz questions. The best way to do this is take some time to go through the notes that you've taken throughout the semester. Compile them into a 1 or 2 page note sheet. The first thing that this does is it compresses that information. It forces you to think and compress that information into a dense sheet that contains the most important things. The next thing to do is, if you have a practice exam from your professor, include that as well as your compressed knowledge sheet that you've generated. Put that into ChatGPT and ask for 15 to 30 practice questions that mimic those on the example exam, and use the material in what you uploaded. This is a great way to get high volume, quick repetition on different questions that may be similar to stuff that you've learned. It's a good way to kind of, prep yourself and prime yourself for the exam. At the end of the day, if I can leave you with anything, it's this. Any endeavor that you undertake is going to be a learning process. And so learning how to learn is one of the best things that you can do for yourself and for your self-development. Because once you know how to learn, any other challenge that you take on will become much easier. I hope that this has helped. If it has, please like and subscribe. Leave a comment if there's anything that you do that you think is a valuable study habit. And if you would like to learn about how to build really resilient consistency, click this video. Thanks. Have a good one.